Welcome back to Wheat Beat. My name is Mike, and today we're not doing anything special with experimentation or doing other weird things like we've done in the past. Today we're just going to make sourdough, and I'm going to show you my process from the very beginning, starting with the starter, all the way through to the final bake where we're going to open up the loaves and take a look inside. So this is going to be fun because I get to show you the entire process from start to finish in something that I've been refining for many years. I've been making little tweaks here and there, and I found something that seems to work very well for me. And I think that if you follow along and you do most everything that I'm doing here, you're going to have equally good results. You don't need a special mixer, but I am using a spiral mixer, which is what is typically used for commercial bread making. You can use your stand mixer, your KitchenAid mixer, or even do things by hand, and it would work equally well because we're not relying on a very good mix, mechanical mix with a machine. In this case, we're relying on time. There's two ways to develop that dough. One is to mechanically mix the flour and the water together, and that causes the flour to hydrate much more rapidly. Hydrated flour is really what causes dough development, gluten development. So the faster you mix the flour and the water, the faster the gluten will hydrate with water and the faster it will develop. You can also use time. So if you just take flour and throw some water and just kind of roughly mix it together and leave it for 8 hours, you're going to get approximately the same level of strength and dough development as you would if you mixed it for 5 or 6 minutes with a strong mixer. So the advantage of not mixing it a lot and letting the dough hydrate over a long period of time is that during that long period of time, you have enzymes that are working, you have yeast that are working, you have bacteria that are working, and all of those things are creating flavor and aroma and the kinds of things you associate with very high quality bread. So today we're going to be using that method, and that's why you don't need to rely on any very special equipment. The only other special equipment you might need is like an oven I have back there, which is a commercial oven with steam injection, but frankly you don't even need that if you're doing a small batch. If you've never used a Dutch oven before, that's really my tried and true solution if you don't have a commercial oven, and I'll leave a link up above or in the comments below with more information on how you can use a Dutch oven to get essentially the same results as I get from a commercial oven. So the bottom line is that you can do everything that I'm doing here. The only other special equipment that I'm using is a pH meter. That helps me understand where I am in the process. I will also leave a link up above for past videos that I've done on how to use a pH meter and how to make sure that you know which stage you're at relative to the pH, which gives you a slightly more optimal result. But again, I think that with just maybe 1 or 2 experiments at home, or even just trying a few things, variations, you're going to get to the optimal result very, very quickly. So I'm not too worried about that. So we're going to start by talking about the flour. I'm using an 11.5% protein flour, which is important for you to know because if you just go to the store and get all-purpose flour, it could range quite a lot in percentage. The percentage is how much gluten is in that flour, and that impacts how chewy it is, how stretchy it is, and other properties that are very important to dough, of course. So when I say 11.5% protein, if you can find flour that's 11.5%, it's on the label, then that's going to make it a little closer to the formula that I'm going to list below. Otherwise, you might have to supplement with a little bit of gluten or dilute it with less flour with less gluten. But 11.5% is typically considered all-purpose flour. Now, in addition to the flour, I'm also using wheat and rye. And so what I do is I put it through the mill and I get this flour out of it. And let me just jump real quick and show you that this is what I was doing earlier. I took, as you can see, these whole berries. They're often referred to as berries. And I ran them through the mill, as you see here. And out comes the flour that you see here. And so if you don't have a mill and you don't want to do this, that's fine. You can just buy some bagged ground rye and wheat, or you can just use wheat or just rye or none of them. I use these because I think it adds a little bit more richness and texture to the flavor, which to the bread, which I think is very nice, but it's not mandatory. The other thing is we prepared this starter here which looks like this. And this is about 1 kilogram of levain, which is a sourdough starter. And we're going to incorporate that into our other ingredients, and that is what's going to cause the dough to rise. And there's no other commercial yeast in here or anything else. And I'll jump real quickly to that video to show you how I prepared this. So we're here the night before. It's 9 o'clock at night right now, and I have my starter here that I've been refreshing every 12 hours for the last 3 or 4 days after I took it out of refrigeration. I'll talk briefly about that in a little bit. But I'm going to take some of this starter. I'm going to create a much bigger batch with some flour and water, and then tomorrow we'll incorporate that into our final dough. Now, I know that the starter is good because when I put it in here, you'll notice that it floats. And so when your starter floats like that in the water, that's a good sign that it's developed enough to be used. But I also know because it's been 12 hours since I refreshed it. So now that I've put in the right amount of starter, which in this case is 10%, I'm going to go ahead and mix this in and get it nice and even in the water, and then I'll add the flour. And now we've put in the right amount of flour, and we'll just get this mixed in so all the flour is hydrated. And there we go. So this is going to be covered, and then I'll leave it on the tabletop here for about 12 hours or so, and then tomorrow hopefully we'll see this almost double in size, and then we can use it. Now I'm going to go ahead and transition over to my original starter, which I used to transfer here, and we're going to refresh this. Now I'm talking about the starter because a lot of people ask me how I go about doing it. There's different methods and timing, so I can share with you what I do. I use one of these 8-ounce mason jars. I find it to be pretty easy. And then what I do is, you see I have some starter left over there. I will actually scoop out almost all of it so that I'm really left with just a very small amount of starter inside there. It's just a little trace of it around the sides and the bottom. And then what I'll do is I'll put in about 50 grams of water, mix it all together, and then add 50 grams of flour and mix it into a homogeneous mass. And then I'll just cover it and leave it on the tabletop for 12 hours. Now every 12 hours, I'll do a refreshing of that in exactly the same way. Just scoop almost all of it out and then just put equal amounts of water and equal amounts of flour. Now, a lot of people will criticize that and say, oh, it should be a lot more scientific. You should have 10%, 20%, or weigh out basically the amount of starter you're mixing in with the fresh flour and water. And I, of course, have done it that way for years. But then in the last maybe 4 or 5 years, I got pretty lazy and I just stopped measuring it. I just scooped out the vast majority and left a little bit of starter inside, and it actually has the exact same effect. I haven't noticed even the tiniest bit of difference in the quality of my starter, and of course, most importantly, the quality of my final loaves. And it takes me a lot less time to do that because I don't have to start with a clean cup every time and weigh out the amount of starter in the water. It saves me so much time and makes it very, very much an easy process as opposed to what it was before. Now, because I already did my starter for tomorrow, I'm ready for my bread tomorrow, I'm actually not going to be using this starter again until the next time I bake, which might be in a few more days or even next week. So if I refresh this now, I'm going to let it rise for probably less than 12 hours, maybe like 8 hours. And when it starts to, when I see it starting to rise and starting to build gases inside, I'm just going to put it in the refrigerator. So I'm not going to let it mature completely. I'm going to let it get maybe 75% of the way there and then put it in the refrigerator. How long do I keep it there? I've kept it in there for 2-3 weeks, sometimes even a month, and it gets like a little bit of a watery, almost a gray colored liquid on top. It gets very runny. It doesn't look very happy or healthy. And at that point, you can scoop out maybe half of it, put in some fresh flour and water. 12 hours later, refresh it. Do that maybe 2, 3, 4 times, and you're pretty much good as new. There's a lot of mythology around sourdough starters where people talk about their starter originating 500 years ago in medieval times and all that kind of stuff. But really, when you look at the microbiology of what's inside here, the strains of bacteria and yeast are almost exactly the same, whether it's here or in France or 500 years ago. There really isn't that much variation. There are a few subtle changes that occur over time, and those changes are relative to your location. So if you live in a certain environment with certain temperatures, certain humidity, you're going to favor some strains of bacteria and yeast over others, but the vast majority of the yeast is going to be the same regardless of where you are for bread making. So it's kind of romantic to think of these things as being like 1,000 generations old and coming from all these exotic locations. But really, it comes down to your specific location and your specific environment, and how you treat this and how often you refresh it will dictate what strains are stronger and what strains are weaker. And that's just the reality of it. But when you talk to your friends, you should definitely tell them it's like 1,000 years old from, the time of the dinosaurs. It makes for good conversation. So here we go. I'll just show you one refresh. This is that mason jar with just a tiny bit of the starter left inside. I put in maybe 45 grams of water. I'll mix this around so it's nice and homogeneous. I kind of scrape down the starter that's on the sides of the cup and kind of get it all incorporated in there. Okay, and now we'll tear that, and we'll do an equal amount of flour, which we said was 45. So now we'll mix that together. So I have found that if you do a lot more than 45 grams of water and flour in an 8-ounce mason jar, this can overflow when it starts to rise. So sometimes I just scoop out a little bit here just so there's a little less inside the cup and then it doesn't overflow on me. So I just loosely wrap some saran wrap on top of this, kind of like that. I just kind of tighten it around the edges. And then I'll just leave this out like this for about 8 hours or so. When I start to see that it's where it is here and it rises to about where my finger is, maybe almost doubles in size but doesn't quite get to the top. At that point, I'll put it in the refrigerator and I'll leave it there for a few weeks if I need to. So in that last part of the video, you saw I had that 8-ounce mason jar that I inoculated the next round of levain, of starter material. And so very early this morning, at about 6 this morning, I was up. It was about 70% proofed or risen, and I put it directly in the refrigerator, and that's where it will sit for a while until I need it again. And then when I need it, I'm just going to take it out of the refrigerator and refresh it once or twice and then use it as needed. So that was done this morning. This is now, we're at about 12 hours since I made this levain last night. And now we're going to put all the ingredients together in this bowl and get it started. Now this is a 10-quart bowl. It's the maximum I can use for this batch size of 16 loaves. If I was going to do anything larger than this, I would have to use my 40-quart mixer, which is a lot harder to clean and a lot more clunky. So I try to avoid using that bigger mixer unless I have to. In this case, I'm only making 16 loaves, so it's not really that much. And I'm going to use this one with a removable bowl because it's just a lot easier to deal with. So I'm going to put all the ingredients together in this bowl. We'll just do enough mixing to get the process started, and then we'll go from there. So we'll start by putting in the water. So I said we were using an 11.5% protein flour, and I do want the flour to be a little bit stronger than that so we get more rise and we get slightly more strength to the dough. And so I want to supplement the amount of gluten in here from 11.5% to something closer to 12.5%. And so I use my handy calculator to understand how much gluten to add to get to the protein level that I desire. So I will leave a link for this as well on my blog. I've created a calculator where you just need to put in the amount of flour you're using and the protein level you're at, and it will just spit out the amount of what vital wheat gluten you need to add to get to a higher protein content. So this is useful, especially if you're making pizza and you want a very strong, chewy dough. Then you're going to add quite a bit more gluten, or even for a sourdough like this. So it's a really handy calculator, and I'll leave the link. So I supplement with this so that we have a little bit stronger dough. So now I'm going to go ahead and add that fresh milled whole wheat and rye. So now I'm weighing out the flour, and this is the 11.5% protein flour that we were talking about. This flour happens to come from Central Milling, which is based out of Utah, and I pick up this flour directly from the mill in Logan, Utah, and I can even leave a link if you want to kind of see what that looks like and where this place is. But obviously you can buy this flour in other places. You can even buy it in Costco. It happens to be stocked in our Costco nearby. So now I'm going to add the rest of the flour to my water with the milled rye and wheat, and I'm actually going to let it do what's called an autolyse. Autolyse just means that you're not adding the yeast and the bacteria from your starter. You're not adding the salt. You're just letting the flour and the water interact for usually about a half an hour. And what that does is it helps activate the enzymes that are going to help with the way that the dough handles and also the way the dough develops. And it's a very common technique that you can use if you want to minimize the amount of mixing that's required to fully develop your dough. So we are doing an autolyse today. I'm going to mix all these things together, roughly get them incorporated, and then let them sit for about a half an hour. Then I'm going to add the starter that we made last night and the salt. So here I'm just mixing some of the flour and water. I'm not adding any of the salt because the salt actually prevents the enzymes from fully functioning and imparting their effect onto the dough. And I'm also not adding the yeast from the levain because I don't want those properties to be imparted on the dough either. I'm saving that for after the autolyse. So I've mixed the flour and the water together, and it's been sitting for about 30 minutes to autolyse. And now I'm going to add the levain, which is the starter that I made last night. And then we're going to mix this together with the salt and get our final dough moving along. So we'll go ahead and get started here, and I'll put this on a high speed. And as you can see, this is really pretty much the capacity of this bowl. I'm going to now start adding in the salt slowly. This is not that critical. I know there's a lot of urban legends out there about incorporation of salt, and I'll leave a link in the comment section there so you can see some experiments that I did with this that pretty much shows that it's irrelevant if you add all the salt at once on top of the dough, or you just add it very gradually. Suffice it to say, it doesn't really matter, but this is how I introduce the salt. I pretty much just dump it in while it's mixing. So we're going to let this do just a very basic mix. We call that a short mix as opposed to improved or intense. This is a short mix, and it's just to make sure all the different parts and pieces here are fully incorporated, the salt and the levain and the water and the flour. And then we're going to put it in a bin, and we're going to check the temperature and check the pH, and we're going to let it start the bulk fermentation process. This is why it's easier to have a removable bowl, because then you can get this into your bin a lot more easily than if you had to scoop it out of a giant mixer. Still not easy, but easier. Okay, so got it in the bin. It looks, as you can see, pretty scraggly. It doesn't look like a smooth dough at all. It is a cohesive mass, but look at how it falls apart. It doesn't create any kind of a window like you would expect. And that's okay, because we're not expecting that. We're going to develop this dough with time. We're not going to develop it through mechanical agitation. So that's why we're going to let this sit for 5 hours, and we're going to keep folding this every half an hour for at least the first couple of hours to build some strength. And you'll see how this dough starts to change over time just with time alone, with no mechanical mixing at all. So let's check the temperature. We're at 71 degrees, which is just about where I would want it to be. And then we are going to check the pH here in just a second. Now this is my pH meter here, and before we use it every time, it needs to be calibrated. So I put it in the different calibration solutions and calibrate it. You really need to do it every 12 hours or at most every 24 hours so you get accurate readings. So I'm going to start by calibrating this, and then we'll take a reading of our dough over here so we get a baseline. Now that it's been calibrated, I'll go ahead and check the dough here and see where we're at. And we are at pH 5.7 right now, which is where I would expect freshly mixed dough to be. And now every half an hour, we're going to fold this for the first 2 hours, and then we're going to let it bulk ferment for a total of 5 hours before we start to divide and shape the dough. So take a look at what it looks like now, and then we'll look at it here every half an hour or so. So it's been a half an hour, and I actually have wet hands here because it's a lot easier to fold the dough when your hands are wet. And we're going to go ahead and do a fold, and I'll show you how I do it one time. I'm just going to lift up the edges here and just fold it over like that. Rotate this, lift it up, rotate, and I'm going to do this on all 4 sides. And then I'm going to flip the whole thing over here like that, and that's what we're left with. And as you can see, the dough looks a lot more smooth than it did a half an hour ago. Now when I pull it, it doesn't tear apart as easily, and if I stretch it out, I can actually start to form a window with it without it tearing too much. So you can see it's tearing, but it looks significantly better than it did just a half an hour ago. So that's what a difference just a little time will make, and one fold. So we're going to cover this back up. I'm going to do this 4 more times. So another half an hour has gone by, and with wet hands again, I'm going to do a fold, and this time I'm just going to double check the pH to see where we're at. Now every time you do a fold like this, you're strengthening the dough, but you're also incorporating oxygen, which is important for the yeast as it develops and replicates. Yeast does need oxygen to replicate itself. So, and also the oxygen helps strengthen the gluten. So there's a lot of benefits to doing these folds, and we're doing more of them at the beginning because that's when the oxygenation is most important for the development of the dough. And now we're going to check here with our pH meter to see where we're at. And it's been about an hour now, and the pH is still around 5.65, so it's hardly changed at all, which again is expected because we're only at the beginning stages. As we progress, that's going to probably change more. So let's close this up and give it another half an hour. All right, so this is the 4th time I've done the fold, and the dough has gotten substantially stronger. You could see that by the time I got to the 4th fold, it was very hard to do, and the dough's quite stiff now, but definitely a much better situation than we had before. See, I can make this gluten window now, and it's actually pretty springy and good quality. And so we're now 2 hours into this. I'm going to continue to do this now every hour, and as we get closer, I'll start checking the pH, and we'll see how things are changing that way. All right, it has now been 5 hours, and let's take a look and see. It's looking pretty good, actually. Fairly puffy. I can definitely feel air bubbles in here. When I stretch this out, I can see that it's nice and strong, and I can pull a pretty nice window here, as you can see. I'll do a fold here in just a second, but the next thing I'm going to do is just check the pH and see where we're at, because my target right now is about 4.6. So we'll see where we're at. As you remember, we started the day at 5.7. It is now 5 hours later, and sadly, we're still at 4.97 here. We're just barely under 5, which tells me that this is not quite ready yet for the next step, which is the dividing and shaping. So what I'm going to do is just fold this, and then I'm going to wait another half an hour and see what happens. But this is a perfect example of how the pH can affect your timing, because so many different factors affect how quickly this dough progresses, and the pH gives you a direct measurement of where it's at, how much acids have been created, so that you can understand at what stage you're at. So I'm going to fold this, I'm going to wrap it up, and we'll come back in a half an hour and see. All right, it's been another half an hour, and we'll take a look and see where we're at now with the pH. And you can see that just in half an hour, we've dropped the pH to about 4.65 or so. So that was a pretty substantial difference. Right now, the pH is dropping kind of on a fairly sharp slope. So for every half hour we leave it here, it's probably going to get considerably more acidic. So I think at this point, I'm ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and take this out on my work surface, and we'll start to divide and shape this. And as you can see, this dough is very cohesive, and as we've said before, it's nice and strong. It's has a nice window to it when I stretch it out, and so this is looking good. I can also smell it, which you can't, of course, on your end, but you can smell the sourness to it here, the acidity. It's certainly got a sour smell to it. You can just get a little flour on there and spread this out so it's a little bit more uniform. And now we can take our bench knife and we can start dividing this into our individual pieces. So once we do this about 16 more times, I'll be done with this dough, and then I'll immediately shape these. Now, in some cases, it's recommended to let it rest. So you do what's called a pre-shape, which means you make it into something close to your final shape, and then you let it rest for, let's say, 15 minutes or half an hour. And the idea there is that it's easier to shape it that way, but I don't do that at all, and I've never found there to be any sort of problem with going directly from dividing like I'm doing here to the final shape. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Once I finish this dividing, I'm going to immediately shape them and put them in the baskets. So I've divided all my dough into the right number of pieces. In this case, it was 16, plus I had about half a loaf worth that I have on the side. And then I'm going to shape these either into rounds or oblongs, and then I'll show you right now how I do the shaping. All right, let's go ahead and start shaping. We'll start with a round, and I just try to put in the minimum amount of flour incorporated into the dough, because if you incorporate too much flour into the dough and then you start to fold all that flour in, unhydrated flour, you might end up with streaks, gray streaks, or other things that don't look the best inside your dough. So you want to try to avoid incorporating too much flour. So I just put the bare amount so that I can do what I'm doing here, which is move this thing around and then do some folding without it sticking to everything. So as you saw, I pushed this into a square. I now folded the top one into the middle. You can rotate it like that and basically do the same thing, pull it into the center, and now you have this oblong type shape. Now you're going to take one end and bring it to the center. You're going to take the other end and bring it to the center, and you're back to a square now. I'm going to flip that over so the seams are down, and I'm going to take my hands and kind of pull on this a little bit and then rotate and pull and rotate. Every time I rotate it, it's stretching and dragging the bottom so that it seals the creases that are under there. And when I pull it like that, it stretches the top skin of this a little bit, so it makes it
a more smooth and uniform surface. So I'm just going to rotate and pull until I end up with a fairly tight ball like that. Take out my basket, and then I can put the seam side up like that. And that's all there is to it for the round. Now let's take a look and do the same thing with an oblong. So we're going to do something similar. I'm just going to drag a little bit of flour, not too much. There you see some extra flour. I'm going to push that out of the way. And then I'm going to just push this down again into more of a rectangular shape as opposed to a square. And that will help us make the oblong shape a little more easily. So as you can see, I've stretched this to pretty uniform thickness. And now I can do the same thing I did before. I'm just going to flip the top part over to the center and just press it down with my fingers a little bit so it's sealed. And then I'm going to rotate it. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to push this to the center. Now notice that in this case, this looks longer than it did before. I'm going to stretch and pull that to the center. I'm going to stretch and pull that to the center. And although it looks more or less like a square, it's actually more of a rectangle at this point. And now I can just flip this over, and I can drag again my fingers as I pull. It sticks to the bottom just enough so that it seals the gaps down below. I'm going to rotate it 180 degrees and do the same thing, kind of just pull it like that. And I only have to do that like once or twice, and you end up with a oblong shape. I'm now going to put it again, seam side up, right into the basket. And one of the first things that you're going to notice is that it doesn't fill the whole basket. So there are baskets that are shorter than this. I don't stock every single shape of and size of basket that's out there. These were just very convenient for me to get, and this works fine for me. I have found that if I fill this entire thing with the loaf, I end up with something that's fairly thin and long, almost like more like a baguette than the kind of loaf that I'm trying to go for here. So after a lot of experimentation, I simply found that if I partially fill it, I end up with exactly what I want. Make no mistake, this is going to proof and get longer, so this is not the final length of the dough. But this seems to work for my purposes, and you'll see in the end result how this comes out. So now that I'm going to make a few more of these rounds and oblongs, and once I get through all of the dough that I have here, then I'll go ahead and put them in the proofer, and we'll move on to the next step. So I'm done with my last loaf, and I'm about to put the last remaining loaves into the proofer. Before I do that, I just want to show you one last thing, which is how to check if your dough is properly proofed. I'm going to use a pH meter to do some of this, but most people don't have that, or they want other techniques for understanding how well their dough is proofed. So the best way to do that is through a finger test, where you can just literally poke the dough and get a feel for how quickly it bounces back. So I'm going to show you that right now on a dough that I know is not properly proofed, and then when it is properly proofed, you'll see the difference. So here's just a loaf of bread, and I'm just going to use my finger, and I'm just going to press in here like that. And you notice that when I do that, it pretty much bounces right back. There's no indentation left almost at all. Let's try it on another spot over here, and you'll see that it just bounces right back. It's almost like I never did anything. Now, when this thing is ready to go into the oven, and it's at the right pH, and it's proofed the right amount of time, then you're going to see the difference, and we'll compare them. And then you'll see when you are at home checking if something is ready to go in the oven, you can also do this. What you would like it to do is when you push it and let go, you'll still see that it's indented, and it very, very slowly comes back to its normal shape. So let's put this in the proofer right now, and it's going to be there for about 3.5 to 4 hours. And then we'll check the pH and make sure that it's at the right pH level, which I would like to be around 4.0 to 4.1, maybe 4.15. So we'll do that and come back in about 3.5, 4 hours. All right, so it's been about 2.5 hours, and we're checking the pH now to see where things are at. We are at about 4.36 or so, and we would like to get to about 4.0, 4.1, 4.15, something like that. So this is still too high, and that's expected. So we're going to give it at least another hour and check again. I'm also going to do that proofing test just to see where we're at with that now. And I'm actually going to get a little flour on my finger because I think it'll be easier to show this. So without flour on your finger like this, it's a little stickier and harder to show. But notice now when I do this, it's different than before. I push this in, and again, I need a little flour on here. I push that in, and it's bouncing back. It is recovering. You can see the one I did over here is almost back to where it was. This one also. So this takes some skill and time to learn how to read this dough. So when you push your finger in it, you kind of look to see how quickly things are recovering. And to be honest with you, it's still springing back fairly quickly. You can see how it just springs right back. So I'm going to show this to you again in another hour when I think it's ready to go in the oven, and you'll see the difference. So here we are about an hour later. We've gotten this thing down to 4.2. I was hoping to get the pH to about 4.1. So I think we're going to give it another half an hour. 3.96, approaching 4. So this is pretty much ideal for me in terms of getting it in the oven. I think we'll get the right level of sour flavor and enough rise. Now let's take a look at our proofing using our finger pressure test, and we can compare it to what happened last time. So notice here what's happening is I press this in, it stays indented, you see? And it is very, very slowly coming back. The proteases that break down the gluten have been working, and this still has some springiness to it, but the fact that it remains kind of indented and very, very slowly comes back tells me that this is ready to go in the oven. So the pH meter gives me a sort of more scientific version of this, but the finger test for home is plenty good. So I'm going to go ahead and load these into the oven now and get them in there. So before I take these out of the basket, I like to put a little semolina flour on the bottoms of these because it makes releasing them a lot more simple and makes them less likely to stick to the loader and to the oven floor. So once I sprinkle some semolina flour on there, I then kind of get my fingers in there to just make sure that this is going to separate well from the basket. And so I just kind of tease it there a little bit. I kind of roll it to the sides like that and just kind of make sure that this is going to release pretty easily before I just dump it onto the loader. So I'm going to do this for 8 loaves, and I'm going to load 8 at a time, so 8 per deck for a total of 16. And once I finish teasing all these in the baskets, we'll put them on the loader. All right, so these are ready to go onto the loader, and so now that I've loosened them up, I can just kind of roll them off the basket and onto the loader like this. And now we'll go ahead and score these. So I'm going to come at an angle like this and just do one slice across the top. And same thing over here. So for this round one, I've made this letter J that just out of a piece of paper and cut out the letter. And then I just have some rice flour that I'm going to sprinkle on like this. And then when I lift that off, we have a letter J. And then when we bake this, you'll see how that comes out. So now we'll go ahead and load these in the oven. apply some steam. And we started the timer, and then now we're going to load the next 8 loaves and put them in the bottom oven. So we are at about halfway into our bake on this top deck, a little bit longer to go on the bottom deck. And what I like to do is about halfway point, I will go ahead and open the vent so that the steam will start to escape from this chamber. I also lower the temperature from 475 on the top to about 440, and from 460 on the top to about 425. And I'm mainly doing this because I find that the bottoms tend to burn if I don't do that, and I end up getting it to be too dark. This is a matter of preference. We have on the West Coast, there's a tendency to bake things very hard, which means that they are almost to the point of being burnt, and that's perceived as being good on the West Coast. On the East Coast, that's just considered burnt. So it just depends on your own particular preferences. I also, because I so much don't like the burned bottoms, I actually take one of these racks, and about halfway through the bake, I do that. I simply take the loaves and I put them on a rack so that the bottoms don't get any darker than they already are. And then I'll let it finish the bake from there. It has about 16 more minutes to go. And I'm gonna do the exact same thing on the bottom deck when that one's ready. So our time is up on the top deck. I'm gonna go ahead and take out the loaves. And then I'll bring them over to the cooling rack and we'll take a look at them. So here are the 16 loaves out of the oven. We have our stencil J. I did 2 of them just in case one of them didn't turn out well. It looks pretty good. This one came out a little bit lopsided. That one's a little more round, but my scores weren't good here, so you can see that it didn't open up as nice on one side, and so neither one is perfect, but certainly acceptable. Overall, the ears are well developed. I can't find too many technical faults with this. It's not burnt at all on the bottom. It's nice and crispy. You can see the blistering on the surface, which tells you it was the dough was fairly acidic. You have good openings on all of these. So I would say overall, these turned out quite nice. You'll probably notice I have a fan running over here. You might notice that sometimes in bakeries, they have a fan running over the doughs that come out of the oven. And this is to cool them down as quickly as possible because you want them to not lose too much moisture. So if they cool down more quickly, then they won't evaporate as much water as opposed to a loaf that's sitting out at a pretty high temperature for a long period of time. It will actually dry out faster. So that's the reason I have the fan running on these. Once these cool down completely, I'll go ahead and slice a few open and we'll see what they look like inside. Well, the loaves are basically cooled at this point, where as you can see in the clock behind me, almost exactly 12 hours since we started all this with mixing the dough. So this process does take quite a bit of time, but I think the take-home message was that you can do all this without any special equipment. Yes, I use commercial oven. Yes, I use commercial mixer, but you don't need any of that to get a really great outcome because you have the benefit of time. And time is on your side because it does the dough development for you without having to do the mechanical agitation. So if all your mixer does is just get everything together and does a rough mix, and then you give it a whole bunch of time with hand folds like we did all day today, you're going to be getting a product that looks very much like what we got today. So I did slice open one of the round loaves and show you what that looks like inside. I think the crumb structure is very nice. So we have some irregular holes here that I think are pretty indicative of what is considered artisan bread. And that also is because we didn't use a lot of mechanical mixing. We did mostly work by hand. So the gluten network is fairly irregular, and so you get irregularly sized holes inside.
but they're not what I would call obnoxiously big. And so sometimes you see sourdough bread and there'll be holes in here the size of golf balls. And it might look pretty in pictures, but when you cut it into slices and try to put anything on the bread, it just falls through those holes. So it's not super practical. I like holes like this. I think it's a nice look, but it's not so large that it's hard to use. And when I look at the crust, the rim of the crust here, I can see that it's a nice color, a golden color, and thin, and it's also crispy. I can feel that crisp to it. So the aroma is very good. Obviously, I can't share that with you, but overall, I think the result is quite nice. And I think that you could do this too. If you follow the formula and do everything the way that I did, minus the pH meter, minus the spiral mixer and the commercial oven, use a Dutch oven. As I said earlier in the video, I'm going to leave a link for using Dutch ovens. If you're interested, leave some comments below, and I can even do a video on Dutch ovens, and I can even do some loaves in a Dutch oven, in a regular home oven that I have here, and then do some in the commercial oven, and we can compare the difference and see. I have a feeling that the ones coming out of the Dutch oven are going to be exactly the same, and so that might be an interesting thing to try if anybody's interested. That's all I had for today. I just wanted to show you my sourdough process from beginning to end, and also talk a little bit about some of the tips and tricks that I have developed over the years. So I hope you enjoyed today's video, and until we meet next time, go out there and bake something.